브루킹스 연구소 선임연구원인 조슈아 멜처 님의 발표로 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 네.
Great. I want to say thank you to the U.S. Embassy and to OpenNet and to the Korean Law School, the American Law Center, for hosting this event and for inviting me to be here to discuss what I think are some particularly important issues. I know there's a specific bill which is controversial at the moment. What I want to do, though, in this presentation is to take a step back and to go through in a little bit more detail the development of the digital space, the implications of the global internet and cross-border data flows for international trade, and some of the opportunities that this will provide for Korea, and to have a discussion around some of the digital trade rules that are developing in this space, which I think are also particularly relevant for thinking about the best way forward here. So this is a attempt to capture some of the magnitude of data flows happening, looking at submarine cables. This is partly looking at between the United States and Asia, and US and Europe and Latin America. And really the point I just simply want to make here is to give you some sense of the scale. The largest trans-border flows of data have traditionally been between the United States and Europe, and that in many respects also reflects the size of the trade and investment relationship between the United States and the EU. But certainly you can see that the US-Asia data flow capacity is very significant, and in fact that's where most of the growth is now happening. And this slide, which is a fairly well known McKinsey one, simply picks up a similar data point, but also gives you a sense of how this has changed over time. And what we can see is very significant exponential growth, in fact, in cross-border data flows. And I really think one of the points I think that's worth emphasizing is that as we move into a digital economy and a digital trade environment, what we are going to see is that growth in data flows globally is going to essentially underpin a lot of what we consider to be important in the international trade space going forward. So just to pick up a couple of key digital trends to think about the implications here. One is that we have approximately half the world is online, but though that does mean that half the world still does not have basic internet access. Internet access, as I think we all experience, is increasingly a mobile experience, and it is also very much an economy-wide phenomena. So we should not be thinking about this issue as simply one about IT companies or large internet companies. In terms of what the economic and trade implications are, this is really about how does the entire economy go digital? How does your manufacturing sector become smart manufacturing? How do your services get delivered online? How does agriculture take advantage of data to be more productive? So on and so forth. This is very much like a general purpose technology which diffuses economic activity in its entirety. And this is leading to transformations in international trade. So just picking up a couple of key data points. In the global data flows, by one estimate, were increased GDP around 2.8 trillion in 2014. To give you a sense of how significant that is larger than global trading goods in 2014. And it gets to my point that digitization, and we'll talk about this more, is increasingly going to be the main game when it comes to international trade. The World Bank has done various studies which have shown very strong correlations between internet penetration and export growth. And a recent study by UNCTAD underscored one aspect of digital trade, which was e-commerce, valued at approximately 25 trillion in 2015. Worth noting here is that 90% of that e-commerce is B2B, not B2C. And this gets back to my point that we get very focused on the consumer-facing internet experience where you are on Amazon or you are on Google or Facebook, but a lot of the commercial value is being actually driven in a B2B fashion, not a B2C fashion. And the cross-border component of that which is only the B2C, which is the only data point, was approximately 189 billion in 2015. So I just wanted to sort of unpack the notion of how we think about the relationship between cross-border data flows and international trade. And there are two aspects to think about here. One is that essentially a lot of actual trade is now in data. So if you think about, for instance, services that are delivered and consumed online, essentially that's a completely data-driven service. So if you access cloud computing services, if you access software, content online and consume it online, you're essentially consuming a data-driven service. You also have another element to it, which is the focus of a lot of discussions in the WTO, is this notion that you go online, you make purchases, but the actual final good gets delivered to you. So that's a very traditional sort of e-commerce, eBay, Alibaba type experience. And the delivery of actual content as well is a very core part of that. But then also there is the way that cross-border data flows also now enable a lot of commercial activity. So a lot of this is internal company data movements, whether it's in in HR data, a lot of R&D data, communications, and increasingly you see with complex and large companies, and this is very relevant obviously for large companies here in Korea, which participate in global supply chains, using increasingly advanced data analytics to actually manage supply chains more effectively. And very much, if you think about the next, the second and third and fourth generations of this, as you move into big data and artificial intelligence, all of this is premised on data and the collection of data and the analysis of data. So I just want to pick up a couple of slides here which just underscore, I think, the importance of cross-border data flows when one thinks about the global economy. This is a cloud computing example which just basically demonstrates that if you are accessing cloud computing, it's very much a cross-border data flow phenomena. Cloud computing has been referred to by some as an innovation of significance similar to the introduction of telecommunications and mobile in the 1990s. In many respects, it is about all companies having access to the same type of computational capacity that only large companies used to have access to. It is scalable, it is on demand. It means that small businesses in particular do not have to invest and have standalone IT departments. They don't need to invest in the capital that may or may not be optimized, and they can scale up as business conditions require it. And cloud computing is one of the key, I think, drivers here when one thinks about one of the new digital services around. And this is very much the delivery and the efficiency and the security of data delivered by cloud computing is very much premised on disaggregated global data centers. Big data, I'm sure we've heard a lot about, and there are various iterations of the types of data that create big data, but essentially we're talking about the collection of larger and larger data sets, the application of even more powerful computing capacity and algorithms to generate actionable insights which governments, business, researchers can find useful. And the examples of how this is being deployed now globally are manifold. This just picks up on the notion of the role of data in R&D. collaboration across borders. Increasingly, what we see, for instance, this is some recent research done in the United States, which was looking at the development by US multinationals of global R&D centres outside of the United States, and basically finding that, you know, increasingly what we're seeing is that a lot of the R&D is focused on software R&D, and this is about plugging in essentially researchers globally into a large multinational R&D function which can actually create software which can be applied across that unit, and it is intensely premised on the collection of data and the movement of data globally. But if you think about healthcare, if you think about the ability to develop population data sets that can allow for more sort of accurate targeted diagnostics and better health solutions and so forth, this is very much a big data opportunity. The Internet of Things is an area where, you know, Korea, I think, potentially is going to excel, because it's going to be the combination of manufacturing prowess, sensors, and the collection and use of data to add value to essentially manufactured products and goods. There's a Korean company, Joy Global, which I use as an example because as an Australian, I think about mining too much. But they make mining equipment which they sell globally, and they have data centers essentially located globally, collecting information from sensors embedded in these mining equipment, which allows them to provide real-time analytics to improve mine efficiency, mine operations, to identify when parts on mining equipment might need to be replaced, to have those replacement parts sent out to the mines in anticipation of breakdowns to minimise downtime and the like. But you think about Fitbits at a very personal level. There's going to be Internet of Things in our houses. The use of sensors on aeroplanes, on cars for self-driving vehicles is all going to be very much premised about collecting data and analysing it, and most of that is going to require analytical capacity to happen in different countries and be premised on cross-border data flows. And a lot of this is building on existing technology. So one of the reasons getting the policy settings right now matters so much is because these are iterative technologies that will themselves lead to the development of new technologies. So the Internet of Things is also premised on having access to cost-effective and efficient cloud computing, because a lot of the data now is actually transiting to the cloud. And you can see here that this picks up the iterative development of these technologies. So having big data, cloud computing, and Internet of Things happening most effectively and efficiently is absolutely the key building step towards systems integration. So for instance, if you think about driverless cars, it's essentially a systems integration outcome using various forms of technology, mapping, LiDAR, various forms of radar, and detection services. Artificial intelligence, which is really the frontier, and in terms of using machine learning and neural networks and the like, requires large data sets to train artificial intelligence systems, and this then moves into even more complex technologies. So in many respects, getting the policy settings right is going to be key to enabling economies to be prepared to develop and participate in the second and third and fourth generations. So I want to specifically now bring this back to the implications for international trade specifically, and I identify here 4 key transformations and developments. I think a number of these will be fairly intuitive and straightforward. The first one is platform trade, which is basically the notion that you are on a platform and you can be selling goods or services globally. And so that's an experience some of you have probably already had, whether you're on Alibaba, whether you're on eBay, for instance, and you become an exporter immediately. And I'll go into that in a little bit more. The other is digital services, selling services online directly to consumers. The increased services value add in manufacturing, which is the example I gave before of Joy Global, but it's essentially the key insight, and this was mentioned in the introduction, which is that as we move into sort of smart manufacturing, some call it Industry 4.0. The value add from manufacturing is going to come from data. And this is going to be, I think, for Korea a key challenge and a key opportunity, and of course global value chains. So the digital platform experience, again, is one which is arguably leading to what has been referred to as a democratization of international trade. In many respects, the trading system has been premised and built on large companies moving often large quantities containerized goods globally. And the infrastructure at many different levels has not been well adapted for small companies to participate in international trade. But digital platforms are fundamentally changing that notion. So what this graph shows is, this is data from eBay, and it essentially picks out a bunch of countries. You can see South Korea is there, and it's essentially showing you that if you are a small business and you are on eBay and you are in South Korea, 100% of those businesses are exporting. If you are, that is compared to 20% of their offline peers. And this data essentially plays out in very, very similar ways across countries in developed and developing. And it is essentially that notion that you can be small and you can be on a digital platform and you can be global immediately. And this is providing, so traditionally you're a small business and your market was probably, you know, the town and maybe the surrounding towns. You know, your market share was inherently limited, and this is changing that fundamentally. The trading services aspect is increasingly, we know that services can be delivered online. There's challenges, there's cultural challenges, there's language barriers, there are often regulatory barriers that affect this, but the potential for the internet to significantly open up space for services trade is very significant. Services have been one of the laggards in terms of their integration into the global economy, but again, this is one of the transformations that the internet is driving here. Now, one estimate of that is this notion of digitally deliverable services, and so this data essentially picks up the services that could be delivered online for a variety of countries here. And you can see again for South Korea. So what this picks up is the blue bar is basically digitally deliverable services as a share of total exports. So you can see for Korea, we have a range there of probably between about 5 and 8% of total exports. But then if you also take into account the services, the digital services embedded in Korean goods exports. So this is everything from R&D and design to the type of professional services that are included. You actually see that the value added of digital services in Korean exports is in the range of 28% to over 40%. And Korea, becomes a more significant exporter of digital services, and it really underscores, I think, the opportunity for digitally deliverable services for Korea, but for a range of countries as well. The digitisation of goods bit, I've already spoken a bit about, but it really, if one thinks of, if you take the automobile industry, for instance, obviously another very significant industry in Korea, one of the key questions which faces any automobile manufacturer today is, is the future of automobiles in manufacturing automobiles, or is it in the software and the data and the self-driving capacity that essentially overlays the manufacturing ability? So if one thinks of Tesla, Tesla is essentially valued by Wall Street as an IT company. If you look at the way that its share price is being analysed, it's clearly not particularly good at manufacturing cars. yet it is more valuable than most car manufacturers. We saw this week that GM in the United States is shuttering some factories, but really the big news behind that was the doubling down by GM essentially on driverless cars and investing in that future. So. And this is playing out across manufacturing goods. Value added is going to come not from being just good at producing the good, it's going to come from being good at providing the value added over the top services. And that is going to rely on sensors and the ability to collect data globally and the capacity to analyse it smartly. And global value chains, which everyone understands is a very significant thing that Korea participates in. I think the OECD's got an old number which I think just simply underscores the importance of global value chains for Korea. I think 50% of Korean exports have embedded imports into them. And global value chains, of course, were enabled by the IT revolution. And increasingly, we see possibly two countervailing trends here. One is that the smart manufacturing opportunity is going to further disaggregate production. It's going to further create opportunities for collaboration and better management of even more complicated and sophisticated supply chains, of which Korea stands, I think, exceptionally well placed to benefit from. There's going to be the development of 3D additive manufacturing, which itself could potentially, if it's scaled, and was cost effective, could localise some manufacturing closer to the consumer and transform trade in goods into trade in essentially design. So you would actually transfer the design for the product across borders and actually print it out at the local destination. So what we're also going to be seeing is this move from trade in actual physical goods to trade in designs. And one can think of a simple example as a book. No one really moves books across borders anymore. You simply download that, and that is happening for a lot of media as well. So despite all these opportunities, we're seeing growth in data localization measures globally. And you can see here it just picks up the exponential growth. A whole range of reasons. A big one is privacy and the types of barriers that governments are putting in place in order to transfer personal data across borders. But also you see for health, financial and other reasons. Significantly, there are sort of what I'd identify as 5 key drivers of that, and I'm not going to now go into what these are and why they actually lead to data localization. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. What I do want to just point out briefly is that there are particular costs of data localization, and I think my points about the importance of cross-border movements for all these new technologies and economic opportunities underscores that. But it's basically data localization, if you scale it out where every country data localizes, means that you go from a globalized, efficient internet to a balkanized, localized internet, which raises costs for everyone. It raises costs for consumers, and I think as significantly, it raises costs for businesses as they try to use more costly inputs to become more efficient and effective. So for instance, you take cloud computing, if you require a data center in every jurisdiction, then some jurisdictions will simply not have cloud computing because the economics won't make sense and no one will build them. Or you'll have cloud computing centers and the costs will get passed on to businesses and you'll have a less efficient and effective outcome. But it also means that business models that are increasingly innovative, that are relying on different forms of data collection globally have to adjust and so on. So I just throw these figures out there. I just wanted to give you a sense of scale. This was just an analysis done which looked at proposed data localization measures in a couple of countries and essentially turned the localization measures into non-tariff barriers and then did an economic modelling on it and came out with some figures just to, I think, to underscore the potential economic cost of these various data localization measures. And you can see here, and this South Korean number obviously does not take into account the proposed legislation. This was really focused on data localization measures that were already on the books.
Is that in billions of US dollars per year?
So yeah, that's just percentage of GDP.
Percentage.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to point out is that there's a lot going on in the trade law space. So we're in a law school, so we should talk about law briefly. You know, the WTO, while it's an old set of agreements, has actually a lot of relevant rules for digital trade. The appellate body has made it clear that if you've made a GATS commitment, then you also have a commitment to the data flow to enable that service to be provided. There are also other agreements, including on IP, for instance, that are very significant. There's a process now underway which Korea is part of to try to start a negotiation on e-commerce. I mean, I don't have a lot of hope for this moving fast or being too ambitious, but it's certainly there and happening, which is significant. I think really probably where the action is and will continue to be for the near to medium term is in free trade agreements, particularly on these new innovative rules around digital trade. Korea has been fantastic in terms of its ambition for free trade agreement agendas. It's got free trade agreements, I think, with almost any trading partner that matters now. But importantly, it's also actually been quite ambitious in terms of the e-commerce commitments that Korea has undertaken in its trade agreements. But two new trade agreements worth noting, which Korea is not part of, but will undoubtedly probably be part of at some point. First one is the TPP. We know that Korea was actually very keen to join this agreement when the US was part of it. Once we get through this sort of iteration of the US, this current administration, the US will find its way back to this agreement at some way, shape or form, and at some time Korea will join this agreement as well. It's clearly in Korea's economic interest, and this agreement has a very strong set of data commitments. And this is not just, I think the point underscored here is that when the US left this agreement, right, the remaining 11 countries could have done what they wanted with that agreement, and what they did was they decided that all the digital trade commitments that they negotiated, you know, to some extent because the US really wanted it, but Japan also and other countries thought it was in their interest, they all decided to keep exactly the same digital trade commitments in this sort of reconstituted CPTPP, right? So you've effectively now had 11 developed and developing countries all effectively say, we think these digital trade commitments are in our interest. This was not simply because the US wanted it. And this includes commitments to no data localization, commitments to the free flow of data across borders, and various others which we can talk about. There are exceptions to that, and we can talk about how that might work, but they are tight exceptions. And most recently, we've seen the completion of this, you know, United States, Mexico, Canada, NAFTA 2.0. I bring it up for two reasons. One is that this is the latest iteration of a digital trade chapter, very similar to CPTPP, probably a little bit stronger in some areas. But what will happen, undoubtedly, is that the US and Japan, and the US and the EU, and the US and the UK are all going to start trade negotiations next year, and I'm confident in saying that the trade commitments in this agreement on digital trade are going to end up in these FTAs, certainly with Japan, which is also very ambitious on digital trade. And I just point this out to make the point that this is the trend for digital trade commitments. It is commitments on free flow of data, commitments on no data localization, because everyone is beginning to understand the opportunities and the benefits of creating a digital space consistent with these rules. I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.